How y'all doing? Many of you out there are probably familiar with the World of Darkness tabletop role-playing games. These were originally published by White Wolf back in the early 90s, back as far back as 91. Started off with their, the first and the biggest hit, and it's understandable why, due to the time period, and that was Vampire and Masquerade, where you play a vampire character in a very dark, gothic, modern world. There's also, Werewolf the Apocalypse that came after that, where you play a werewolf character, obviously. Mage the Ascension. There's also a Wraith the Oblivion, where you play a ghost. And there was also Changeling Dreaming, where you play a half-human, half-fairy, and all that. And it's sort of a contemporary fantasy slash horror, mostly horror, although, I say some of it kind of went off the horror scale over the years, but that's a very long, different discussion altogether. Now, for me, I rarely played, and when we did play, it was definitely Monty Hall to my characters, but I do read, like to read the rule books and read the lore and plenty of source books, but most of what I had is Werewolf the Apocalypse, and I also had like the second edition of Mage the Ascension, but many of you are familiar with that, and of course with popular tabletop role-playing games like this, there's going to be fiction around it, not only to give you entertaining stories set in these worlds. For players, this could give inspiration on what their stories can be. So, and I have collected a few of those too. Again, mostly werewolf. I mean, let's see what I got here. Drums Around the Fire, but it's a werewolf anthology. When Will You Rage? That's another anthology for Werewolf the Apocalypse. Another Werewolf the Apocalypse book, Conspicuous Consumption. So, and one of the ones I really like is when they had signature characters for the World of Darkness games. Main characters that they had built storylines around. I like Werewolf the Apocalypse because you had Lord Albrecht and his pack, Mari Cabaret, Heaven Sailed the Past, and they made they had some stories about that, the Silver Crown, and another story involving him, the Last Battle, which is when they ended the World of Darkness through their apocalypse or Gehenna or whatever, basically the end of the world. But Werewolf was the only one I got. I mean, I got the Gehenna book. It's the only Vampire and Masquerade book I've ever read. And I've got one of the Wraith the Oblivion books, and there's Caravan of Shadows. They didn't make too much fiction for that, but there was some in there. So, the book I'm going to talk about, I believe, if I read everything right, it's the first anthology of fiction stories for the World of Darkness. It's not to any one game in particular. In fact, it covers the 3 games that came out at the time. That is Dark at Destiny by Edward E. Kramer. Sorry, it's one of those that use silver letters, so if I do it like, if I don't turn a light, you can't see it. That sort of thing. Now, Edward E. Kramer, he's done a lot of editing for White Wolf books and probably a few other things. He also, I think, did the editing for Michael Moorcock's Tales from the White Wolf, an anthology where Michael Moorcock allowed other writers to write his stories. So, he has an introduction. Now, this is over 20 stories featuring stories from either general horror that can be used for World of Darkness, but mainly vampire, werewolf, and mage. Why not Wraith or Changeling? Well, they haven't came out yet. In fact, I think if I did my research right, this book came out the year Wraith the Oblivion came out, first edition. So, and of course, that's when the book came out. There was plans to make this beforehand. The stories were all originally written for this, I believe, because the copyright was all the same year. I think this is their first printing on this. And this has some good prominent writers here too. In fact, I saw this on the shelf, and I remember seeing this in the catalogs of White Wolf back in the day, but now I looked at some of the writers on this, is like, oh, well, he's got a story in this, so I went ahead and got it for that, and there's an additional writer that I think was a good bonus for that. Ironically, definitely not stories that, that had nothing to do with vampire, werewolf, or a mage. There are other good stories, but we'll get into that. Let's see what we got. Now, I'll start with the first story that got me to buy this book at the used bookstore at the time. That is Sensible City by Harlan Ellison. Yes, that Harlan Ellison of I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream, and the editor of Dangerous Visions, and very famous writer. And he actually wrote a story for this. And this one is a nice, simple, straightforward. Again, doesn't have to do with vampires or anything like that, but it's a story you can use to inspire yourself as what you can add to World of Darkness. And what it is about 2 guys on the run from the law, traveling to get as far away as they can, but the further they go along, they keep seeing these signs approaching a city that they don't want to go to, but no matter how far they try to go away, they seem to get closer towards it. So I don't want to give too much of that. And the funny thing about this story is that comes in this nice little I don't want to see too much of a joke, but nice little clever thing that Harlan is kind of known for. For those of you who know Harlan Ellison, you know what I have when you read the final ending. I guess one could say about maybe A Boy and His Dog would give you a similar frame of mind of the final line on that. So moving on, we've got another major writer here for this story, The Scent of Vinegar by Robert Bloch. Robert Bloch, if you don't know, wrote a book that was made to a famous Alfred Hitchcock movie, Psycho. So, and if I understand it correctly, this is his last story before he passed away back in the mid-90s. So, and this one is this is a story about a man who is investigating an old brothel outside of L.A. And the secrets behind that and why it closed and who were the last proprietors of that. For those of you who know Southeast Asian horror stories, you might be familiar with the type of creature that this is going to present. I won't give it away here. The next one is But I Feel the Bright Eyes by Bill Kreider. This one is one of those, we're trying to be combining a little bit of history with Vampire and Masquerade. It's where basically Edgar Allan Poe is being chased by vampires and he's trying to run away and later try to expose them, but, in the end it doesn't do well for him. Next story is In the Forest of the Night by Robert Weinberg. This one is about a detective hired by different opposing vampires, to find a sacred artifact that they think will help them reach Golconda, which in Vampire Masquerade is a type of enlightenment that would basically help the vampire control his thirst to beast inside. Again, it's a form of enlightenment. And apparently this was done by an ancient vampire, and they feel as if they need this detective's help to help find it. But does the detective have ulterior motives, in trying to search for this? So that's that story. Tools of Enslavement by Rick R. Reed. Now this one is closer to basic Vampire and Masquerade. I'll explain to that later on. This is a story about 3 Toreador vampires who go about their night. When they try to have try to feed, they will hire a prostitute and they will feed on her because no one's going to search for the dregs of society in a sense as they think about it. But one of them finds one who is an established artist, and that if you know the Toreador Clan, the Toreadors are heavily into art and beauty and everything, and now they're in a fight to have her into it, and they get a little bit of conflict with that. Another one is Small Brown Bags of Blood by C.D. Anderson. This is a werewolf story, about the exploits of Get Fenris tribe. Get Fenris are the Werewolf of the Apocalypse. They're the werewolves from Norse descent, Viking werewolves, heavily in the battle, that sort of thing. And this is a story about some of their exploits and what they have to do with it. The interesting thing about this one is there are parts about it where the narrator is saying, it says a line in the same way you watch the movie Starship Troopers, would you like to know more? He says a line similar to that makes me think into that as the story goes along. It's just funny, I think. The Love of Monsters by Nany Collins. Now this one is, I'm just going to tell you the first about it and not going to tell too much in the end. This is about an interesting, a couple driving down the road, and one of them is with child, and you'll find out the nature of these two, of what they are when you see them pull over to a wrecked car and what they do to the passenger. And I'll stop it right there. Winter Queen by Rick Hatala. Now this one's another World of the Apocalypse story. Is about a famous musician. He was in a plane with several others. The plane crashed during a blizzard, and he survived along with one woman who's not quite sane. And as he's trying to survive day by day, hoping they can find him, there's another blizzard along the way, and there's wolves around, and so it's a case of the wolves are not quite acting as wolves. It's a World of the Apocalypse story. So I'll stop it right there to read the next one. Night Games by Richard Lee Byers. Now this one is again one of historical fiction, very similar to But I Feel the Bright Eyes. This one takes place during the Roman Emperor Constantine's reign. So here we are. Constantine gets kidnapped, which the main character, a soldier, is now teamed up with a with Constantine's one of his magicians, and they're trying to deduct that he's being kidnapped by vampires, so they're out to investigate, trying to find him. And what do the vampires want to do with Constantine kidnapping him? Well, I won't get too much of a story about that. But the wizard there has a different is not exactly as he appears as well. So there's that story. The next story there is in the Mage the Ascension category. One of the Secret Masters by Darryl Schweitzer. There's this one guy who had this friend growing up, and as he was growing up, he kept getting more and more into conspiracy theories and all that. Now, the main character, who is a friend of this conspiracy theorist, he doesn't quite buy into that. As he grows up out of college, he's trying to live his life, his wife and daughter and everything. And then his friend starts calls him up all out of the blue. He meets up with him in person, and this guy's kind of ragged as all get out. He thinks he's found a secret ultimate conspiracy involving basically he finds mages, and they're trying to stop him from something, from trying to expose them. And it gets to the guy who gets involved in it. It cuts out, it's a bit more troublesome than what it is. And I'll stop the story right there to continue with another one. The Bone Woman by Brian Herbert and Mary Landis. Yes, Brian Herbert of the Dune expansion, as in son of the famous Frank Herbert, who wrote Dune. Brian Herbert is the guy who continued Dune after his father's death with the prequels and the sequels. Now this one is this is a mage vampire kind of crossover. You have a mage turned vampire and tries to take down this one vampire who is after one other kind who is in her protection, and how she tries to stop him and all that. Very simple synopsis, a bit more than that, but yeah, we'll leave it at that. Now we have another Mage Ascension story, Escobar Falls by Stuart von Allman. This is a story about a mage on the run, and he explains how his powers can work and all that, but he's staring at this woman. He's trying to do his best not to influence her, and you get into this sort of philosophical and actual conundrum he's in about influencing events, which mages can do. But he thinks this woman is out to chase him, and he ends up telling this woman who he thinks is after him and all that his story on why he's on the run. So that's some of the examples of stories here. And some of these stories were good, some of them are kind of okay, some of them don't even fit the established lore as it goes on. Let me explain about that. So yeah, over the years, as White Wolf made more and more books establishing the lore about what your characters and therefore what these creatures in this world of darkness do, this anthology kind of countermands it. Now, to be fair, this was back in the mid-90s when Games Workshop was just now getting started, and, well, they started in 91. This book came out in 95. These stories were published in 94, the time it takes for these writers to do, to write these stories, despite the fact that they're short stories. And there was also poems as well. But it comes to, some of these writers, they don't write strictly as in the established lore, even made up at the time. So, yeah, you got things like, in one of the stories, you got a person that could become a werewolf by drinking the blood of a werewolf, or in Werewolf the Apocalypse, you're born as one, it's genetics. Some of the things they don't get right, like the Nosferatu, there are some characters described as a Nosferatu clan. Nosferatu is already Count Orlok of the famous silent film Nosferatu, and that clan is, anyone embraced into this clan is all hideous looking. They cannot show themselves without exposing themselves as monsters, and the idea of Vampire Masquerade is a hide to humanity as human. But there are some, there's a character described as Nosferatu, but he's not described as hideous. Maybe he is, but he's not described as much. And they have conflict between vampires and werewolves, which is pretty strong conflict. They're usually after each other's throats, but at least in a written text. Now they have made source books like Rage Across Vancouver, where there's an uneasy alliance between vampires and werewolves. But according to the werewolves' belief system, vampires are a very form of ultimate evil, corrupted by the worm, which is part of cosmology I won't get into. So having friends would be few and far in between, but it almost seems like while there's conflict, it's sort of a, it's not as strong as the books could lay out to be. Another one is Offspring between Vampires and Werewolves. children from those two, which is not possible, according to the lore. One of them, a little fact, like the Sabbat, which is a sect of vampires, consists of multiple clans, is described as a clan and not a sect. Then you also have werewolves eating people, which in World of Apocalypse, werewolves can attack humans, but they have a litany, which is their own code of laws, saying that they don't eat humans, not only because they're kind of part human. There is in their cosmology, there's a bit of corruption that can come with eating humans after that. So, and you'll find other facts as well. So, so how is it that if you're a serious player of any of these games and like to stay with the lore, what good is this book for something that tells stories that kind of contradict it? Well, one of the things I tend to notice with White Wolf games, that despite whatever established lore they had, they continuously, throughout many books, tell you, make the game as you want. You don't like it the way we've written it, change it your way. And that's what a book like this can show you. Not all of these are perfect examples for you, but you can see what, if you change a thing here or change a thing here, how that will change what type of stories you can tell. For instance, what if there is still a conflict between werewolves and vampires, but you change the lore to where it could still be there, but it's not as strong? In fact, there could be working relations with them. What kind of stories can you build out of that for crossovers? What if being werewolves could be both born or through ritual become a werewolf? In some ways it did with, look up Samuel Haight, however you think of that character. What about vampires and werewolves? Why not the concept of a half human, half vampire exist out in fiction? Why not have something similar with that? Besides trying to make super powerful characters here. What about werewolves eating people? What if you took that out of World of the Apocalypse, as in, you can, but be careful in some cases. So that's what stories like these can still be of use to a modern player of this. They, may not be the best examples for you, but you can see what ideas you could come up with and where it would go if you change a little bit here and there, and how that could change your game. And maybe even make some interesting ones, or really bad ones, but you have to experiment. So, yeah, that's Dark Destiny by Herbert E. Kramer. And one of the things I do like about this is it does have some illustrations. In fact, if you take a look closely, like in the background out here, you see these kind of a twisted macabre forms. That's done by John Cobb, who's done a lot of work throughout several of the games of White Wolf, from Vampire, Werewolf, I think, Mage, and the others. But at the beginning of every story, there's similar artwork like this that's some more directly related to the story than others. That's one he did for Sensible City. Let me find a, and because it's black and white, doesn't always show up too well, but let me find another one. Sorry about that, but of course, Edgar Allan Poe for a story that he was featured in. Some of it's just a simple one like this, or it's just wonderful illustrations like John Cobb really sets the atmosphere for. I think his work really. I always loved his work in World of Darkness, and it really worked in Wraith the Oblivion. But there you go. So, again, Dark Destiny by Herbert E. Kramer. If you find this, add it to your collection. If you're just a horror fan in general, or White Wolf tabletop games in particular. Again, some of these stories are good, some of them are, okay, some of them are like, I could do without. And also, there's a couple of stories, like, Robert Bloch and Harlan Ellison, their stories could be taken out, because there's nothing in the stories that's directly it's directly World of Darkness per se. There's none of the vampires, werewolves, and all that. They're they could be just generic, not that generic. They're well written stories, but they can fit in. They don't have anything like any of the vocabulary of vampires, werewolves, or mages, and all that stuff. I mean, they don't even feature those at all. But they're horror stories. You can be inspired to what is out there in the World of Darkness. That doesn't have to necessarily deal with Wraith or vampire, werewolves, and all that. But they wrote it for this, so you can use it for that, or you can take it as separate stories. That's why I got them. But again, well, not the best anthology, but there are some decent stories right here, and and there's also 2 other volumes which I have yet to read. I don't know if I'll get around to reading them, but keep a lookout for it. If you like this, you might like the future stories down out. So, Dark Destiny by Herbert E. Kramer, anthology about an anthology set in the World of Darkness by White Wolf Games. Thank you all for watching, and have a nice day.